Hi, welcome to my third video about Generate 3 by Joranalogue Audio Design. In this video I'll be talking about ring modulation and amplitude modulation using the level inputs on Generate 3. I was patching up a basic example of ring modulation to show you guys what it's all about, but of course, as usual, I got carried away and I made a complete patch. So let me play it out and transition to the sound examples. There's quite a few, so if you want to skip to the explanation, I've put up a timing index below, so you can skip to that part if you want to. I hope you find the video enjoyable and informative. So let's get started. Here we go. To better understand how ringmod in Generate 3 works, and ringmod in general, I think it's best to talk about VCAs and amplitude modulation first. So let's take a listen to what I've patched up here. So on the bottom trace of zero scope, you can see the output of even VCO. It's just a low sine. Actually, it's the output of my VCA, but even VCO is going through it. The top trace is in fact what's going into the modulator input of the VCA. So what's happening when you're sending an envelope or something else into a VCA? It does something with the level, with the volume. So you send an oscillator in at full volume and the VCA shuts down or opens up depending on what voltage you send into the modulating input. So the top trace is what's going into the modulating input of the VCA. Now look what happens to the output wave when I send some negative voltage into it. As you can see, as I go below zero, the output of the VCA flips. Now most VCAs stay above zero. By that I mean whatever voltage you send into the CV or modulator input, it just ignores the negative part of it. Now in that case we're talking about a dual quadrant multiplier. A ring modulator circuit is a 4-quadrant multiplier. So we have bipolar VCAs, it's the same thing. So what happens with a bipolar VCA or a 4-quadrant multiplier, I'm using ModMix here, is that whatever you send into the input, in this case the even VCO, gets flipped or inverted when the signal that's going into the modulating input goes below zero. So now let's listen to some modulation. So on the top, we're seeing what's going into the modulator input. It's just a sine wave from Generate. And by the way, what we're doing right now has nothing to do with Generate, because you can do it with any ring modulating VCA, bipolar VCA, 4-quadrant multiplier. There's a lot of things you can call it, but I think it's important just to listen. So to reiterate, sending the sine wave through mats for some offsetting into the modulating input of my VCA. The carrier is the even VCO, it's a low sine. Here you can listen to it again. And this is with positive only modulation. So the top trace is what's going into the VCA. And because this is a bipolar VCA, I need to manually offset my control voltage to show you guys what amplitude modulation is. So now we're listening to amplitude modulation. In amplitude modulation we have a carrier, even VCO, that's not presented on the scope by the way. We have a carrier, we have a modulator, in this case Generate with some offset, the top trace, and then we have the output, it's the bottom trace on zero scope. And with amplitude modulation we can hear the frequency of the carrier in the output. So this is the carrier, and this is the carrier amplitude modulated by Generate. And as I change the frequency, you can hear some amplitude modulation sounds. So there's a nice one. So now to transition from amplitude modulation into ring modulation, all I need to do is take away the offset. And now in fact we're listening to ring modulation. So what's happening now is every time the control voltage coming into the modulating input goes below 0, the wave of the output flips. So there's the frequency of the even VCO as a carrier. When I go into ring mod, by taking away the offset of the modulating input, you hear how that frequency slowly disappears. So a ring modulation, there's no use talking about carrier or modulator, because you'll hear when I flip these around, we get exactly the same. So in ring modulation, the frequency of the carrier goes away. There's two frequencies emerging from whatever you put into the ring modulator. Those frequencies are multiplications of one another. And oddly enough, to know what happens when you multiply frequencies, you need to add and subtract them. So for example, when you have two signals, one let's say 200 Hz, the other one 300 Hz, what happens when they got multiplied in the 4-quadrant multiplier is you get the sum of both frequencies being 500 Hz and the difference being 100 Hz. And whatever signal, especially to the carrier input, goes away. Now in amplitude modulation, let me add the offset again. You get three frequencies coming out of it. You get the carrier, so let's say in our example that's 200 Hz, and then you have the difference being 100 Hz and the sum being 500 Hz. So to really simplify things, you can look at ring modulation as just amplitude modulation, but you're ignoring the carrier. Now let me play around with the frequencies some more, so you can listen to some sounds of two sine waves being ring modulated together. Now currently this is still AM, amplitude modulation, but let me take away the offset again. So now let's dive into Generate 3 and its ring mod and AM capabilities. On Generate 3 there are bipolar attenuators or attenuverters for the different harmonic outputs. When I turn these, the amplitude of the harmonic, in this case the fundamental, which is a sine wave, goes up. Let me lower the frequency. And as you can see, when I put the polarizer in the center position, the amplitude of the signal goes down, and when I turn it to the left, the amplitude goes up again when the wave is flipped. You can see how the wave flips. So now when you send a signal into the input for this knob, it automatically changes the amplitude and inverts the wave. Or when it's a positive signal coming in, it only changes the amplitude. So there you have amplitude modulation and ring modulation built into Generate. And since you have controls for 3 different harmonic generators, you can modulate these together or separately. So on the top trace of Zeroscope, you can see the output of even VCO and this is modulating the amplitude of the fundamental on generate. I explained earlier that when you amplitude modulate a carrier, the output presents three frequencies. It's the frequency of the carrier, it's the frequency of the sum, and it's the frequency of the difference all at the same time. So those two extra frequencies, the sum and the difference, are what I call the sidebands. Now let me go into ring modulation by removing the offset. In ring modulation, you don't get the frequency of the carrier at the output, you only get those sidebands. Now, while this is still easy to understand, when you change the waves from sine to something else, it gets a lot more complicated. You get a lot more frequencies emerging from the two you send in. It's because sine waves only have one harmonic, so when you multiply those, it's still quite easy to predict what you're going to get. But anything other than a sine wave carries a lot of harmonics, and all those harmonics get multiplied together, so the end result is much less easier to predict, and you just don't get two distinct sidebands like you get when you're multiplying two sine waves. In this next example, we're listening to the fundamental wave of generate being amplitude modulated by a triangle wave coming from even VCO. Now let me take away the offset of the modulator. And now this is ring modulation. I'm pulling out the triangle wave, and I'm going for the saw on the even VCO. Let's hear the amplitude modulation by adding the offset again. And you can clearly hear how the frequency of the carrier gets through again. I'm going to move over to the square wave from the even VCO. This makes for very cool graphics on the scope. Here you get kind of a DNA train. Now I've been moving around the frequencies manually all the time, but of course you can use CV for that. So let me add a signal to the volt per octave input on the even VCO. So now we're listening to the sine wave of generate 3 internally being amplitude modulated by a square wave coming from even VCO, which is receiving volt per octave information from an LFO. So let me remove the offset and go into ring modulation again. Now of course, instead of an LFO, I can also use a sequence. And of course, I can use an envelope for this too. And while I'm at it, I'm going to modulate the offset of my modulator, going into the fundamental input on generate. All the sounds are still coming from the fundamental output only of generate. I can even add more modulation to the modulator by sending CV into the FM input. And I can also modulate the PWM. Now let's add some drums. In this next example, there's a lot going on with the cables. All you need to focus on right now is this blue cable coming from the even output of the even VCO going through the scope. It's the bottom line to the level input of the fundamental wave on generate. So the even VCO with the even oscillator is ring modulating the fundamental wave. And while there is no straightforward way to ring modulate the full output of generate, because there's only the separate level inputs here, you could just mult, if you have a passive mult, the modulating VCO and put it in the inputs, plug it into the inputs of generate. That being said, there's no reason why you wouldn't plug different shapes in there. So now the even oscillator of even VCO is ring modulating the fundamental of generate. I have a saw wave from the even VCO going to the even input of generate. This is making for really interesting shapes at the output. And then I have a square oscillator from even VCO going to the odd input on generate. So those three are ring modulating with the separate inputs of generate, and they're coming out of the full output, and they're presented here on zero scope at the top line. And to me this sounds really great, so I created a patch around it. Now I have two signals hard panned. Signal on the left is the full output of generate going through a filter. Signal on the right is the core output of generate going through a ring modulator. And now I'm going to add some phase shift. Now let's add some reverb and some drums. This concludes my video on the amplitude and ring modulation capabilities of Generate 3 by Joranalogue Audio Design. I hope you learned something in this video. I'm sure I did. I found a ton of helpful information on a website called synthesizeracademy.com. It's really interesting to take a look there. I'll put the link in the description of the video. Please share this video with someone who is interested in modular synthesis, especially a VCO that really can do it all. Thanks for watching.
Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage against the dying of the night. No wise men at their end, no dark is right, because their words had fucked the lightning. They do not go gentle into that good night. But men the last wave by, crying how bright their frail babes might have danced in a green bay. Rage against the dying of the night. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Brave men near death, who
could blaze like meteors in the big A. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father,
the understanding hand. Close, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray.